When you rent an Airbnb, you expect comfort, privacy, and maybe even a little adventure in a new place. But what happens when the very house you pay to stay in begins to feel less like a home, and more like a trap? This is the disturbing story of a young woman named Emily, who booked what seemed like the perfect weekend getaway, and discovered the kind of terror that still keeps her awake at night. Emily was in her late 20s, a teacher who had been working long weeks and wanted a break from the noise of the city. She booked a small, rustic Airbnb cabin in a quiet town just outside the countryside. The listing showed cozy wooden walls, a fireplace, and beautiful trees surrounding the property. It looked peaceful, safe, and private, exactly what she thought she needed. She arrived late in the afternoon, greeted by the host, a middle-aged man who seemed polite at first. He showed her around the cabin, pointed out the kitchen, the bedroom upstairs, and reminded her to lock the doors at night, because sometimes wildlife wandered close. His words felt casual, but the way his eyes lingered on her as he left made her uncomfortable for just a second, before she brushed it off. Emily unpacked, set her phone to charge, and planned to spend the night reading by the fire. What she didn't know was that the peace she had come searching for would soon be broken in ways she could never have imagined. The first few hours were calm. She cooked dinner, made tea, and sat on the couch while the woods outside grew darker. But around 10 p.m., the quiet started to feel heavy. Every small creak of the wooden floor seemed louder than it should have been. At first, she thought it was just the old cabin settling. But then she noticed something odd. The back door lock, the one the host had specifically mentioned, rattled slightly, as though touched. She froze, staring at it. After a few silent seconds, it stopped. She told herself it was the wind, but deep inside, she felt a small knot forming in her stomach. Later that night, as she climbed into bed, she heard faint footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not outside, but inside, downstairs. Emily held her breath, straining to listen. The sound was steady, 1, 2, 3 steps, and then silence. She wanted to believe she imagined it, but the hairs on her arms stood up. Her eyes scanned the dark corners of the room. She picked up her phone and checked the time, 12:43 a.m. She considered calling someone but felt foolish. Maybe it was just the old pipes, maybe she was letting her nerves get to her. She lay back down and tried to sleep. Minutes later, she heard it again. A soft shuffle, this time closer to the staircase that led to her room. Her heartbeat quickened. She sat up, clutching her phone, staring at the door. For a long stretch, there was nothing, no sound, no movement. Finally, she worked up the courage to get out of bed. Slowly, she tiptoed to the top of the stairs and looked down. The living room light she had turned off earlier was on again. Her mouth went dry. She knew she hadn't left it that way. The air felt heavier now, and she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing just out of sight. Emily forced herself down the stairs, each step echoing in the silence. She whispered to herself that it had to be nothing. But when she reached the bottom, she noticed something chilling. The decorative wooden panel near the television wasn't sitting flat against the wall. It was slightly tilted forward. She pulled it back, and found a small black camera, its red light faintly blinking. Her breath caught in her throat. She stumbled back, realizing the camera had been pointed directly at the couch, where she had been sitting for hours. Shaking, she looked around quickly and spotted another one tucked behind a vent, aimed straight at the stairs. Her mind raced. Were there more in the bathroom? In the bedroom? Had the host been watching her this entire time? And then, the sound returned. The front door latch clicked. Slowly. As if someone was turning it from the outside. Emily's chest tightened. She ran upstairs, slammed the bedroom door, and locked it. She grabbed her phone with trembling hands and dialed 911, whispering to the operator what she had found. The dispatcher's calm voice told her to stay on the line and keep quiet. Then came the sound of the front door opening. The creak of boots on the wooden floor. And a man's voice, the same host who had shown her around earlier, calling out softly. "Emily. I just need to check something." Her hand shook as she pressed the phone closer to her ear. She knew she couldn't make a sound. Police sirens finally cut through the night air. The man's footsteps stopped, and after a few tense minutes, she heard shouting downstairs. The officers entered, and the host was taken away. But the nightmare didn't end there. After giving her statement, Emily was told that several hidden cameras had been found throughout the cabin, in the bathroom, the bedroom, even the ceiling vent above the bed. The host had been recording guests for months, storing everything on hidden drives. To make matters worse, his Airbnb account was never removed. The cabin was relisted weeks later under a slightly different name. Emily has never stayed in an Airbnb again. And as of today, the host's profile is still active. Would you have stayed after noticing the first red flag? Let me know in the comments. Vacations with friends are supposed to be filled with laughter, late-night talks, and unforgettable memories. But for 4 college friends, their weekend at a small-town Airbnb turned into a nightmare they can't erase. What began as a relaxing getaway slowly turned into a night of confusion, fear, and something far worse, an experience they still struggle to talk about to this day. It was late spring when Sarah, Marcus, Tasha, and Daniel booked a cozy 2-story Airbnb in a quiet rural town. They had been saving up for months to take this trip, a chance to escape exams, work stress, and the noise of the city. The house looked perfect in the listing photos, wide porches, vintage furniture, and fields stretching out for miles. The reviews were glowing, with phrases like, "peaceful stay," and, "the hosts were so welcoming." When they arrived, the sun was setting. An older woman from the neighboring house waved politely from her yard but didn't smile. Her eyes followed them as they carried their bags inside. They laughed it off, chalking it up to small-town curiosity. None of them knew how much that watchful gaze would matter later. They unpacked, ordered food, and played music. The first few hours felt lighthearted, just friends enjoying themselves. But once the night settled in, the house itself began to feel different. Around 11 p.m., Marcus went to lock the front door. He swore he had turned the bolt, but not even 30 minutes later, when Daniel went to check, the door was standing slightly open. They argued about it for a minute, maybe Marcus forgot, maybe the wind pushed it open, but deep down, none of them believed it was just the wind. Later, while Sarah was in the kitchen pouring drinks, she heard the soft scrape of a chair moving in the dining room. She called out, thinking it was one of the others. But when she stepped in, the room was empty. The chair was pulled out from the table, angled toward her as if someone had been sitting there, waiting. Back in the living room, Tasha asked everyone to quiet down. She thought she had heard a voice outside, faint, almost like humming. They turned off the music and listened. The house groaned quietly in the silence, but then, just outside the window, they all heard it, a low, tuneless hum that went on for nearly a minute before stopping. They rushed to the window. No one was there. The porch light flickered twice before going dark. Sarah grabbed her phone to record, but when she opened the camera, the screen glitched, static lines cutting across her view. She lowered the phone and felt the air around her turn colder, almost damp. Trying to shake it off, they decided to sleep, thinking maybe they were just spooking themselves. But things only got worse. At 2:15 a.m., the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway upstairs. Heavy, deliberate steps. Marcus jumped up, thinking maybe another guest had mistakenly been booked. He opened the door, but the hallway was empty. The sound stopped the second he stepped out. Then, back downstairs, Tasha swore the front door, which they had locked again, clicked open. When they rushed to check, it was wide open. This time, they knew none of them had touched it. They huddled in the living room, debating whether to call the police. As Marcus reached for his phone, Daniel froze, pointing toward the staircase. At the very top, in the shadows, stood a man. He was tall, motionless, his face hidden by the dark. For a moment, none of them could move. Then he stepped down one stair. Slowly. Sarah screamed, and the group bolted for the front door. But as they reached it, the older woman from the neighboring house was standing in the yard. She wasn't calling for help. She was smiling this time, watching them, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. Inside, the man descended another step. The humming started again, low and steady, coming from somewhere behind him. The friends didn't wait. They shoved the door open and ran past the woman into the road, not stopping until they reached their car parked 2 blocks away. They sped off into the night, shaking, terrified, not daring to look back. The next morning, after finding a motel in the next town, they tried calling Airbnb support. But when they searched for the listing, it was gone. Vanished completely, as though it had never been posted. Weeks later, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. She started digging through online records about the house. What she found chilled her to the bone. Years earlier, the home had been the site of a brutal crime. A family had been attacked inside, and one of the suspects was never caught. Locals whispered that the house was cursed, and that sometimes people saw visitors who weren't supposed to be there. But here was the part that scared them the most. None of the dozens of Airbnb reviews mentioned a single strange thing. No warnings. No bad ratings. Just peaceful, quiet, welcoming. It was as if every guest before them had stayed silent. Would you still leave a 5-star review just to move on? Or would you warn the next guests what you saw? Business trips are supposed to be simple. You fly in, you stay a few nights, and you leave with little more than a receipt and a few emails to follow up on. But for one man, a work trip to a busy city turned into the kind of stay that would change the way he viewed Airbnbs forever. He thought he was booking a clean apartment for 3 nights. What he walked into was something far more unsettling, and it left him questioning if he was ever truly alone. David was 34, an IT consultant who traveled often for work. He had stayed in dozens of hotels and short-term rentals before without any problems. When he landed in the city that week, he chose an Airbnb because it was cheaper than the nearby hotels, and the photos showed a modern apartment with fast Wi-Fi, exactly what he needed. The host, a man in his early 50s, met him at the entrance. He was polite, but his eyes seemed to stay on David a little too long. He explained the house rules in detail: no visitors, no loud music, no opening certain closets. David brushed it off as just another strict landlord, signed the digital check-in, and carried his suitcase upstairs. The apartment was small but clean. Neutral colors, standard furniture, nothing out of place. At first glance, it looked perfectly normal. But as David settled in, details began to bother him. The first night, after returning from dinner, David noticed the host was sitting in his car across the street. He tried not to think much of it, maybe the man lived nearby. But when he looked again an hour later, the car was still there, engine off, the man staring up toward the windows. By the second night, David began to notice other oddities. A narrow closet door in the hallway had been locked when he arrived. That evening, he passed by and saw it was slightly open. Inside were cleaning supplies, and a small plastic stool placed directly under an air vent that looked into the living room. Later that night, David sat at the kitchen table working on his laptop. The lights above him flickered twice. Then he heard a faint click, almost like a phone camera shutter, though he was completely alone in the apartment. When he went to bed, he noticed something else. A framed picture on the wall near the dresser looked slightly crooked. He adjusted it, only to find a small hole behind it, not quite large enough to see through clearly, but large enough to make him wonder why it was there at all. That same night, at around 1 a.m., a soft knock echoed from the front door. 3 taps. Then silence. He froze, holding his breath, waiting for it again. But it never came. The next morning, when he left for his meetings, he glanced back at the apartment. From a nearby window, the host was watching him. Not casually. Not in passing. He was standing completely still, eyes fixed on David as he walked away. That evening, David decided to search the apartment more carefully. He checked the bathroom, the kitchen, the living room. And then he spotted it. Behind the smoke detector in the bedroom ceiling was a tiny lens, a hidden camera. His stomach dropped. He looked closer and found another camera tucked inside the television stand, its small black eye pointing directly at the bed. Panic set in. His heart raced as he began scanning the room. He found wires running behind vents, another small device near the lamp, and a blinking light beneath the couch. David realized he had been watched since the moment he checked in. Then came the sound that froze him in place, the click of the locked hallway closet door slowly opening. He stared at it, his throat dry, unable to move. The knob turned slightly, then stopped. Whoever, or whatever, was behind that door didn't step out. The silence was heavier than any noise. David grabbed his bag, stuffed his laptop inside, and without turning the lights off, he ran out of the apartment. He booked a last-minute hotel that night and contacted Airbnb the next morning. When authorities searched the apartment, they found multiple recording devices hidden throughout the unit, all wired to a small storage server in the locked closet. The host was questioned, but somehow his listing remained online weeks later, simply updated with new photos. David hasn't used Airbnb since that trip. And even now, when he checks into hotels, he spends the first 30 minutes searching every vent, every smoke detector, every picture frame. Because as he says, everywhere I go now, I check for cameras. Would you ever trust staying in an Airbnb alone? Or would you check every corner the moment you arrived? For many couples, booking a countryside Airbnb is about peace and quiet. A chance to step away from the noise of the city, to relax, to breathe fresh air, and to enjoy a slower pace. That's exactly what Emma and Daniel thought they were signing up for when they rented a small house in the countryside for the weekend. The listing promised rolling hills, starlit skies, and absolute privacy. But what they got instead was a stay that ended with questions they've never been able to answer. And to this day, they still talk about the night they came closer to danger than they ever expected, simply by booking a weekend away. Emma and Daniel had been together for 5 years. They both worked long hours in the city, and this trip was meant to be a chance to reconnect, just the two of them. The Airbnb looked charming in the photos, an old farmhouse converted into a cozy guesthouse, surrounded by wide fields and thick trees. The host had left the key under a flower pot, so they didn't meet anyone on arrival. At first, everything seemed fine. The house had a rustic charm, creaky floors, wooden beams, and shelves lined with old books. A handwritten guest book sat on the coffee table, filled with notes from past visitors who had stayed there. They laughed about how isolated it felt. No neighbors in sight, no streetlights, no cell signal. It was exactly what they had wanted. But isolation has two sides: it can feel peaceful, or it can feel like being cut off. By the end of their first night, it became clear which side they were on. The first odd thing happened when Emma stepped outside to get firewood. She thought she saw someone standing at the edge of the field, just beyond the tree line. A tall figure, motionless, almost blending with the shadows. She blinked, and the figure was gone. She told herself it was nothing, but when she came back inside, Daniel noticed she was shaken. Later, as they flipped through the guest book, they noticed some entries that didn't match the cheerful tone of the others. One page read, "We had to leave early. The people around here don't like outsiders." Another said, "If you hear knocking at night, don't open the door." The handwriting was messy, rushed, as if the person had written it in a hurry. That night, the power went out without warning. The house fell into complete darkness. Only the fireplace gave off light. Daniel went to check the breaker, but the switches looked fine. When he returned, Emma whispered that she had heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps. They sat quietly, listening. Then came a scratching sound on the living room window. Not the wind. Not an animal. It was steady, like someone dragging a finger across the glass. Daniel grabbed a flashlight and shined it toward the window. For a split second, the beam lit up a face, a mask staring back at them before vanishing into the dark. Heart pounding, Daniel locked the doors while Emma tried to call for help, but there was no signal. They whispered about leaving immediately, but the only road back to town was a narrow dirt path, and it was pitch black outside. Then came the sound of the back door creaking. Someone was inside. Daniel grabbed the closest thing he could use as a weapon, a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. He stepped into the kitchen and saw the back door wide open. The cold night air rushed in, carrying the smell of damp earth. In the hallway, Emma froze. A shadow moved across the wall, tall, thin, and deliberate. She whispered Daniel's name, and as they turned the corner together, they saw him. A man in a plain wooden mask, standing completely still in their living room, as if he had been waiting. The man didn't speak. He just tilted his head slowly, like he was studying them. Then, as quickly as he appeared, he stepped back toward the open door and slipped into the darkness outside. Daniel slammed the door shut, but their fear didn't end there. Through the window, more figures appeared. At least 3, maybe 4. All wearing masks, all watching silently from the edge of the property. The couple realized they had no choice, they had to leave. They packed what they could in seconds, ran to their car, and sped down the dirt road with their headlights bouncing wildly. Behind them, in the rearview mirror, Emma swore she saw figures standing in the road, lined up side by side, watching the car vanish into the night. They made it back to the city safely, but the story didn't end there. A month later, Emma looked up the listing out of curiosity. The photos were the same, but something had been added to the guestbook section. The most recent entry was short and unsettling. The next guests never checked out. To this day, Emma and Daniel don't know who those masked people were, or what would have happened if they had stayed. All they know is that they will never again book a rural Airbnb. They packed what they could in seconds, ran to their car, and sped down the dirt road with their headlights bouncing wildly. Behind them, in the rearview mirror, Emma swore she saw figures standing in the road, lined up side by side, watching the car vanish into the night. They made it back to the city safely, but the story didn't end there. A month later, Emma looked up the listing out of curiosity. The photos were the same, but something had been added to the guestbook section. The most recent entry was short and unsettling. The next guests never checked out. To this day, Emma and Daniel don't know who those masked people were, or what would have happened if they had stayed. All they know is that they will never again book a rural Airbnb. Which of these 4 stories made you reconsider booking an Airbnb? And would you still feel comfortable staying in one after hearing them?